Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. I hope you all are enjoying your spring so far. I, for one, am glad that it is spring. I'm not a fan of winter. And while where I live, the springs tend to be cold and go on longer than I would like before it gets to really warm weather, I'm glad that we're really out of the truly frigid temperatures, or at least let's hope. Today, the podcast is going to be a little bit wonky, if you want to call it that. I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics in light of the Census Bureau's population estimates release from last week. Every year, the Census Bureau releases estimates of the population. This is in addition to their every 10-year physical counts, and that often tells us a lot of interesting things that are going on. It's not quite as accurate, but it's pretty good because they rely on things like death records and birth records and IRS tax data, so they know where you moved, for example, based on where you filed taxes. You can do a lot of interesting research based on that. And these give us a snapshot of what is going on in the world. But before I dig into that, I want to remind you again, if you have not signed up for the American Man newsletter, please do that. You can do it at american-man.us. This is a men's lifestyle newsletter. It is a great complement to what I do here with the more intellectual product that I produce. This is lifestyle. We talk about products you can buy. We talk about culture you can consume. We talk about self-improvement. We talk about great examples of men out there in the world that have done things that will inspire you. I don't write it, but one of my colleagues does, and I'm very involved in it. So I hope that you will sign up and check it out. It's american-man.us. Now back to the census release. The title of the podcast I took from an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch talking about that particular region, which has really been essentially a stagnant region for a long time. A local analyst there said that their region had entered a demographic winter. And that is basically the case for the United States as a whole. Last year was not a good year for population growth in the United States. In fact, it was the lowest year of population growth ever recorded. Now, some of this is definitely due to people dying from COVID. If you don't think people died from COVID, a look at these population numbers will tell you that they did, but it's not just that. But first, let me just read a few things that give you a bit of a picture of what went on in America last year. I mentioned that it was the slowest year of growth on record in the United States. 3/4 of all counties in the United States had what is called natural decrease. So population growth comes from two forms: natural increase, which is more people being born than dying, births minus deaths, natural increase, and migration, people moving in, people moving out. And migration can be international, could be immigrants coming into the country, or it could be domestic. It could be people leaving California and moving to Texas. Again, we call the component of population growth natural increase because typically there are more births than deaths. But we reached the point last year where in 3/4 of the counties in the United States, there were more deaths than births, more people dying than being born. This is what natural decrease is. We also saw big population losses in a lot of areas. So among the metropolitan areas of the United States, the kind of urban regions of our country, 1/3 of them lost population last year. And the biggest coastal metros lost big amounts of population. The New York Times said that New York, LA, Chicago, and San Francisco lost 700,000 combined people. That's a lot of people. You probably don't live in a city that has 700,000 people in it because there aren't that many of them in the whole country. So that's tremendous loss. But it's not just the perennial losers like Chicago. Again, Seattle, Portland, Boston, Washington, D.C., and even Miami all lost population last year. And that's not just in the central city. That is in the region as a whole. These big coastal metros lost a lot of population. In fact, this is something of a reversal. Prior to this recent past, larger cities were actually growing faster than smaller or more medium-sized cities. Whereas in these results, the larger cities were losing population. Again, even places you might not think, like Miami. You've probably seen a ton of press about tech people moving to Miami. Well, why did Miami's population decline? I didn't look into it in great detail, but Miami has a very, very large international population, and immigration has declined a lot, something we'll talk about in America. What growth there was in America was hyper-concentrated in a limited number of boom towns. Only 10 counties accounted for 80% of all the population growth in the entire United States last year. I mean, that's hyper-concentration. So what were those counties? I can't name them off the top of my head, but Maricopa County by Phoenix, for example, where Phoenix is located, is one of them, some counties in Texas, etc. There are also smaller places that are not in the top 10 counties because they're small, but are also growing very rapidly, like Idaho. The cities in Idaho, the state of Idaho, growing very rapidly. Texas metros are growing very rapidly. Raleigh, places like that continue to grow very rapidly. So some of the boom towns continue to grow. They continue to have large amounts of population growth, but most of the country is stagnant or even losing population. Again, there are close to 400 metropolitan areas in the United States, and a third of them actually lost population. Population loss has been pretty rare, again, particularly with immigration sending a lot of new people to many of these metropolitan areas. So there were relatively few growth stories. Now, what caused this collapse in population growth and the dynamics that we're seeing? I will give a few things that are going on. One, of course, is COVID. A lot of people died from COVID. And we can go through and talk about, yes, many of them were very old. They were probably going to die soon anyway. And maybe we'll see that in the future. Maybe we'll see that deaths in future years will go down versus what might have previously been projected because those deaths were pulled forward a year, 2 years, 3 years on account of COVID. Nevertheless, people died in COVID. Okay. However, COVID deaths are not the only thing going on. We've also seen a tremendous decline in birth rates in America. The fertility rate in America went into a decline around the time of the Great Recession in the 2007, 2008, 2009 era. What you'd seen before that is a lot of talk about how European countries like Germany and Italy and Spain had these really low fertility rates, but the United States was doing pretty well. We were slightly below replacement rate. Well, now our fertility has dropped a lot. Some people predicted that there would be a COVID baby boom. People are going to be home by themselves, cramped up in the house, working from home, and that's going to lead to, well, you can imagine what it's going to lead to, and we're going to have all of these babies being born. But that was not the case. There was an even further baby bust during COVID. Fertility in the United States has been dropping very, very sharply. That's not just true of the native-born white population. That's true of immigrant populations as well. Birth rates are going down a lot. So the demographics of the United States are now looking much more like what we'd see in Europe or East Asia than they previously would have. And again, one reason I bring up demographics in other countries, I put out a post on the newsletter a few weeks ago, which was a roundup of what's going on in East Asia. East Asia is China, Korea, and Japan, basically. They've had all of the same problems, in many respects even more advanced in terms of family formation decline, birth rate declines than we're having. So it's very easy to look at the United States and say, there's some factor here in America that is causing these fertility declines. And if we just fix this factor here in America, we will start having kids again. Well, I look at East Asia and I say, well, there are places that are very, very different culturally. They have very, very different legal environments, very, very different political environments, policy environments, and yet experiencing the same or worse. Again, Europe, same thing. Fertility rates have been declining even in a lot of the developed world. There's still pretty high fertility in parts of Africa, which is really poised to dominate the globe in terms of population growth. I believe by 2050, the population of Africa was projected to double, and basically the lion's share of population growth in the world was going to be in Africa. But I think that might even be an over-optimistic projection. I think African fertility rates are also dropping. So we've had this problem where there's just structurally lower births. An interesting piece of research I would like to do is kind of the segmenting the population by how many kids that they have. I was just down in Dallas this weekend hanging out with a bunch of people, and a lot of them have lots of kids. You always meet these, trad Catholic families or Christian homeschool families. Not unusual to see people with 4 or 5 or even a lot more than that kids. And so I see people with all these kids, and I'm like, that must mean there's a lot of other people who don't have any kids or have one kid. I only have one kid. It would be interesting to look at where the children are being born in terms of born into families of X size and whether that's been changing over time. I don't know. I'd have to look into the research. That'd be like a little research project I could take on. But we have declining fertility in the United States, and that appears to be structural, and I don't know that it will be easy to turn around. Now, sometimes these things just kind of go in waves and cycles. Sometimes we don't do anything, and yet a negative trend that we see reverses itself all of a sudden. So sometimes things happen. There's a pendulum that does shift. Things don't go linearly, but this has been a big problem in the United States, falling birth rates. And it's going to have tremendous societal implications as more and more people do not have kids, are not married, or maybe have one kid, a kid out of wedlock. The entire dynamics of America are going to change. Think about the elderly populations of baby boomers today, or even pre-boomers. If you look at them, many of them are being cared for by their children as they get older. There are people there, helping to look out for them. Well, when you don't have kids, right, or you've only got one kid instead of 3 kids, just to share the load, that becomes much more difficult. And then you look at divorce or just never marrieds. It creates a lot of potential challenges down the road. And people with kids think very differently than people without kids. When you have kids, you're more future-oriented. When you don't have kids, especially when you're younger, you become very consumption-oriented. And your preferences in terms of public policy are very different. So this is something that's going to have profound impacts on our society. Another thing that's been driving these population declines is a decline in immigration. You've probably seen or heard the chaos down at the southern border of the United States, where essentially anybody who wants can just walk into America, claim asylum, and be paroled into the country and probably never, ever deported. And it's not just Mexicans coming into the country, and not even Central Americans. There were a huge group of Haitians that came in that way. People are coming in from Africa and all these different countries. They realize if they can get to Mexico, they can just waltz into the United States. And that might make you think that we've had a massive immigration boom, but in fact, we haven't. We've had declining immigration. COVID certainly put a damper on international migration. And there's a huge split among different analysts as to whether we're going to see a fall off in migration or whether we're posed for a massive migration explosion. Who knows what's going to happen there? But we did have structurally declining immigration. Now, a lot of people will say, if we're having low fertility, we need to increase immigration. Well, I would be of the opinion that basically you can't just substitute immigrants for native-born births. I sort of made this analogy when I was talking about Anglicanism in a podcast a while back. Everybody I know in a quote-unquote Anglican church in the United States is someone who converted to that tradition. I don't know any of them who were raised Episcopalian and somehow ended up in an Anglican church in North America. And I'm sure there are some. I know there's entire dioceses, so don't get me wrong. But this is a denomination that is growing through conversions. And when you have a denomination that is all conversions, or a church that's all people who are new, all converts, and there's nobody there who grew up in that tradition, there's nobody there who's got multi-generational ties and been around a long time, it's going to have a very different culture. The idea that it's going to have a traditional culture, that it's going to change, is just not going to happen. And even if you could, in a quote, LARP it by dressing up in the appropriate vestments, etc., it's just not going to be the same as a place where there's a large number of people, maybe a majority of people, who were born to that tradition and are very culturally of that tradition. I always say, yes, I'm basically Reformed today. I attend a Presbyterian church, but I'm not culturally Presbyterian. I'm not culturally Reformed. I didn't grow up in that tradition. The people who grew up in that tradition have a very different approach to the faith. And this is going to be something that's very true of the United States. The idea that, well, we'll just go get people from all over the world and we'll populate our cities and our states and our counties with these people instead of having kids. You can do that. But the idea that it's still going to be the same place is just not going to happen. Once different people move there, it's going to be a very different place. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be some level of cultural continuity, some level of kind of cultural residues that come through. I've mentioned before the law of first effective settlement, which says that the first group of people who permanently settle a place, stamp the culture of that place in ways that persist. You can think about the ways that the Dutch stamped New York City into a kind of a globalist, open mercantile society, for example. But nevertheless, when people come in and changes, they're going to portend profound changes. Geographies, cities, countries are not like the proverbial old trusty axe. I've replaced the head 3 times and the handle 4 times, but it's still the same old trusty axe. Human beings are not widgets. They're not interchangeable. And if you say, we're not going to have any kids and we're just going to bring in all immigrants, what you're basically saying is we're going to liquidate the place that we grew up and essentially hand the keys over to other people, which you can do if you want. I'm not saying you can't do that, but let's not pretend that it's something different. And that's been true of immigrants in the past. We think of new immigrants. Look at the Ellis Island. They were assimilated. Well, the fact is, Ellis Island immigrants profoundly changed and radically redefined what the United States was. So if you go back to 1875 America and then looked at 1955 America, there was a very different concept even of what America was and the culture of America and many, many other things that were a result of the Ellis Island era of immigration. It profoundly changed America. Yes, there was a lot of assimilation, but also, there was a lot of assimilation by the United States. So what I would just say here is human beings are not widgets. We're not axe handles. You can't just take, one out and put another one in. No, it's the same because the numbers are the same. Human beings are individual. Human beings come with cultures. Human beings come with relationships. Human beings come with a lot of different things that are very particularized. And so it's not always, a one-to-one substitute in that. So immigration decline is another factor in the decline of population in America and these negative demographics that we're seeing. And so what are some of the implications of this? Well, again, I don't have academic studies to back this up, but my impression is that decline produces concentration and centralization. I mentioned earlier, 10 counties accounted for 80% of the population growth in the United States, according to the New York Times. If you look at that, you have to say that decline in all these other counties has produced concentration of growth in a limited number of places. We have a limited number of boom towns that people are moving to as other places demographically stagnate. turning around that sort of demographic stagnation can be hard. You see the same thing in Japan. Japan's population is declining, and the population is essentially centralizing in Tokyo. People have been moving into Tokyo. It's been one of the places that's been able to keep its population up because as things go downhill, people start moving and going to the places that still have growth, still have opportunity, that are still growing strong. So we're going to see very uneven geography to the extent that we are in a period of decline. And this is one of the things I always argue about Indianapolis. If I live in Indianapolis, and it was sort of a sleepy backwater small town, really, up through the 1970s. And then the 1970s, and especially in the 1980s, it became known as the essentially diamond of the Rust Belt, this story of a Cinderella city that had, began to revitalize its downtown. It had started growing in population, growing economically, and of course it's continued to do since then. But what happened in the 1970s and the 1980s? Deindustrialization. So as deindustrialization hit all of these small industrial cities in the state of Indiana, they began to go into a period of decline, and the kids started leaving. They started moving away. There's no job for me at the factory anymore. I'm going to move to the capital. I'm moving to the metropole. I'm moving to Indianapolis. And so we've seen that. We see it in Ohio with Columbus. People are leaving all of these failing, clapped-out towns in Ohio, and they're moving to Columbus. Decline tends to produce centralization. And to some extent, I would argue that the growth of some of these cities, like in Indianapolis, like a Columbus, and probably like many of these Sunbelt cities, is an artifact of decline elsewhere. Without the decline, they would not have grown. Just as, to some extent, not the entire extent, to some extent, China's gain was built on our losses. Our manufacturing losses translated into China's gain. So declining environments produce these sorts of weird effects. It's sort of like we're used to inflation, but when you get into deflation, things are very, very different. And so when you get into a declining environment, you don't have a growing pie. You can't give everybody a bigger slice. Thinking becomes zero sum. People stop moving in. It creates sort of calcification of the culture, and it has proven to be quite difficult to turn around these places that have fallen into stagnation in the country. So this is one that I would be keeping an eye on. A second one is what's going to happen on the coasts. You're hearing all the stories. Oh, people are fleeing California. They're fleeing New York. What I would say is I am not anticipating that New York City is going to go down the tubes anytime soon. There is essentially unlimited demand of people to live in New York and in San Francisco because they're just very unique cities. There's just not a lot of places like them in the country. They're very, very, very expensive. So if people start moving out and the prices go down, which happened during the pandemic, what happens? People who say, hey, I can get in now. I can afford to get in. There is a line of people waiting to get into Manhattan, waiting to get into San Francisco. Now, is that true of all of these cities? I don't know, but I'm not predicting, another 1970s type era in places like New York. And in fact, even in the 70s, New York never really lost the kind of population that other cities did. I think New York was only down maybe 10%, maybe 15% from peak, whereas cities like Chicago were down 25%. A lot of these places are down 2/3 from peak population. New York never really had a mass exodus of people for whatever reason. So if you're expecting the implosion of some of these places, I would not expect that. However, most places are not Manhattan. They don't have that draw. And one thing that we saw clearly was an exodus from central city core areas to the suburbs. We saw that here in Indianapolis. The Indianapolis is a merged city-county government. So you have essentially a city and you have a county. They're the same. This county, our city, had been growing several thousand people a year for the better part of a decade. So last decade, we grew population very strongly. And we were in like 950s or something like that population. If it had stayed on the same trajectory, By the time the 2030 census rolled around, we would have crossed the 1 million population threshold, which would have been kind of a big deal to get to a million people. Well, last year, according to the census estimates, we actually lost 6,500 people. And that's because we had very high net outmigration to suburban areas. And I know the urban defenders, what they say, well, some of that is students didn't come in, or, young people worked remote and it'll normalize. And it may well be. But I do believe there has been something of a structural shift in favor of the suburbs and away from urban areas. In fact, I think we would have even seen a bigger exodus from the cities if there were more suburban houses to move into. The real estate market has been extremely tight, especially in a lot of these suburban areas. And so you might want to move to the suburbs, but you can't. And I think one of the things that's really happened is that there has been a change in that a toxic dynamic has taken hold in these central city areas culturally, driven by essentially this woke bubble, which now dominates everything. And in many, if not most American cities, there is essentially zero pushback. No institutions, no major civic leaders are really willing to stand up and confront it. There's actually been probably more of this in the bigger coastal cities because they've seen the most advanced kind of cultural problems. So think about Seattle, for example. Seattle had all those riots in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and homelessness is just everywhere. And they had these essentially progressives who'd been running the city. Well, they just had some recent elections, and they've elected some moderates. And they even elected a Republican city attorney, who I believe may be the prosecutor there. It's not clear, but I gather from the news media that the city attorney is a prosecutor in that case. And so, we're going to a more moderate brand of politics, and it may well be that this spreads back, but I do think in the meantime, this has been something that has been a tacit driver of people leaving. So I want to read a couple comments that I think sum it up that were left on the article on a local newspaper talking about the population loss here in Indianapolis in the center city. One of the people wrote this. They said, "The representation at the State House is unappealing to businesses and many people. Indiana, a home to esteemed facilities of higher learning in Bloomington, West Lafayette, and South Bend, is a place to leave for most graduates. Amazon and higher tech for Indiana? No, never. Not unless more reasonable, comprehensive behavior from the State House occurs." Now, of course, I've criticized the people in the State House, so I'm somewhat sympathetic to the State House. But this person named Lauren B., this newspaper doesn't show your last name, had a very interesting response. She wrote, "The year 2013 called and wanted your worldview back. To think that I used to agree with you in your ilk. I, too, used to be embarrassed about Indiana's seemingly backward thinking. The difference is that I had the humility to recognize that I was wrong. If talented people go to places with progressive policies, and urban centers tend to be progressive compared to the rural hinterlands, why are so many major cities, and our cities, the one losing population? The affluent urban dandy hipster features that made our big city centers attractive places to live have also turned them into groupthink bubbles. Because everyone either thinks exactly the same or are afraid to step out and call attention to an obvious problem, facing rejection and cancellation and potentially job loss, the same agglomeration of talent that worked well for 20 years is now undermining these exact same alpha global power centers. They seem incapable of solving basic issues like clean and safe, which seemed obvious just 5 years ago. Have people forgotten? Are they afraid to speak up? Or have they just gotten fed up and moved to those backwards hinterlands where they can more freely voice their opinions? What about all of the above?" And I think there's something to this. One of the things that I've heard from multiple folks out in California is what you have to understand is a big reason people are leaving California is the schools. Their schools have gone completely woke, and they just want their kids to get an education, and they're not getting an education, but they can't say that they're leaving because of schools, because all of these activists are watching everything everybody does, and if you fight anything at the school, if you say anything on that on social media, they're going to take it and send it to your employer. They're going to send it to Google and Facebook and get you fired. So they say, well, I'm moving for taxes, or I'm moving because of crime, or they use some excuse like this. But I do believe this sort of Orwellian, suffocating progressivism that has taken over, and I mean completely dominates these places, such that essentially there is zero dissent in a lot of these places, is a factor. It's a factor in my wanting to relocate to a suburban environment and outside of the urban core. Even though I'm an urban core person, I'm like, this is just not a safe place to live for me. Not physically unsafe, it's just socially unsafe. So we'll see where I end up. And again, will this stay forever? Maybe if people like Seattle, get a handle on things and start turning the tide, this will be a little different. But I do think right now, bad governance driven by progressive groupthink in the city that make it essentially impossible to face crime problems, to deal with homelessness problems, to deal with anything without just mass attacks all over everything. It's sending people out to the suburbs. And so I think there has been and there will be, for at least a period of time, a shift to the suburbs. That doesn't mean I think the cities are going downhill. I think even our urban core is still growing, is still doing well. But we see in the census figures, there has been a shift to the suburbs, and how that will happen over time is to be seen. And again, I think it may have even affected like Nashville, where there was an exodus to the suburbs in Nashville, very big growth places. So this is something to keep an eye on. But this idea that we have now entered a demographic winter where structurally low birth rates are going to be with us for a while, I think is one to watch out for. And it's going to have profound effects on the geography, the economic geography of America, the growth geography of America. And it's going to be something to keep an eye on as you assess where you want to live. So thank you for that. One of the things I want to do, again, is keep you informed about what is going on in the world and give you insights into the nature of the world that we live in. So this just gives you some on population dynamics and regional geographic distinctives. And this will hopefully help you understand what's going on and navigate this world we're in. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you next week.